So I'm going to start by talking about a philosopher, though it's a philosopher who's more commonly thought of not as a philosopher, but as an economist. I'm talking about Adam Smith. So in the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith claims that without society, it would be impossible for people to engage in a process of critical self-evaluation. So he thinks that people outside of society would certainly respond to their environment. They would desire certain things. They would fear other things. They would have thoughts and feelings, of course. It's just that they would have no thoughts or feelings about their thoughts or feelings. They would exhibit behavioral patterns, that sort of thing. They would have a personality, we might say, but no self. Now, we take such a person and bring them into society, and according to Smith, everything changes. So you put me in society, what happens? Well, I observe other people. I observe other people behaving in certain ways. And so I naturally evaluate them. I judge. I approve of some things. I disapprove of other things. I hold people accountable when I think they've done something wrong. Pretty quickly, though, I realize that people are doing the exact same thing to me. And so I start to wonder about the extent to which I deserve their approval or I deserve their disapproval. So driven by feelings of accountability, I start to look at other people I start to look at myself in the same way that I look at other people, in the same way that other people look at me. Smith writes that we suppose ourselves the spectators of our own behavior and endeavor to imagine what effect it would in this light produce upon us. So this, according to Smith, is how we develop the capacity for critical self-evaluation, the capacity that we lacked when we were in social isolation. So we engage in this process. We think about ourselves from a detached perspective. I'm going to call this a self-distanced perspective. We engage in a process of self-distancing, and by doing this, we develop the capacity for critical self-evaluation. By self-distancing, we develop a moral self. And Smith thinks this is a very important process, and it changes us. It changes the way we think. It changes the way we feel. And he makes two particular claims about the effects of self-distancing. First, he says that self-distancing moderates our emotional reactivity and enables self-control. He writes that when we do this, we feel some degree of coolness about our own fortune, and that the process abates the violence of our feelings. So it just moderates everything. And secondly, he claims that self-distancing leads us to place more weight on the rights and interests of others, thereby enabling what he calls a proper comparison between our interests and those of other people. So he thinks that originally, before we self-distance, we really focus on our own rights and our own interests, and we more or less disregard or de-emphasize other people's rights and interests. But self-distancing teaches us something. It shows us a different way. It shows us that, as he writes, we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other. It shows us the propriety of resigning the greatest interests of our own for the yet greater interests of others. It shows us that we value ourselves too much. Now, this account of self-distancing, the psychological mechanism by which we develop a moral self, supports a particular conception of virtue. I won't read the quote, but this is what Smith says. The basic story is that Smith sees the perfectly virtuous moral agent as one who feels keenly for others and who at all times regulates herself from a self-distanced point of view. So what we have here is a complete philosophical account that connects an account of the development of the moral self and moral motivation to a particular conception of virtue. But the whole philosophical account rests on a foundation of empirical psychological claims. And so we need to ask about these claims. We need to ask, does self-distancing actually moderate emotional reactivity and enable self-control? Does it lead us to place more weight on the rights and interests of others? As it turns out, we have very good evidence, produced primarily by my colleague Ethan Kross and others, about question one. We have good evidence that Smith was exactly right about claim one. But we know virtually nothing about claim two. And so that's what we would really like to study. So I'm going to turn it over to Ethan now, who will tell you more about our proposed study.
Thank you. Ethan Kross, experimental psychologist, University of Michigan. About, I guess, 3 years ago or 4 years ago, Warren, I got an email in my inbox saying, I found you on Google, and I'm really interested in distancing, and I'm doing some work in philosophy on it for my PhD, and Adam Smith has some things to say, and I think you might be interested to know what they are. And normally when I get emails with that tone, the conversations that follow aren't very pleasant. because it's usually something I've missed. But this particular conversation happened to be really enjoyable. And we've continued it for about 3 years with no formal mechanism to capitalize on our conversation. So I'm going to get to the deep integration bit right here from the start. One of the things that really, really excites us about this, this whole project is the opportunity to finally capitalize on some of the conversations we've been having. So I've been studying this process of self-distancing, getting psychological distance for the self for about 15 years now. And I've been studying it primarily in the context of self-control. If you cue a person to take a step back, if you will, and there are lots of ways we can do that, and I'll talk a little bit about one particular way today, what happens to that individual's ability to regulate the self? Here's what we know. I won't go into it in detail. But we do know that self-distancing enhances people's ability to perform under stress, to regulate their emotions in the short and long term. It enhances goal perseverance and motivation. It boosts executive function. And we importantly see evidence for many of these different processes across multiple levels of analysis, from the brain to autonomic responses to implicit measures and self-report. One defining feature of the proposal that you'll see here is that we really are trying to be integrative, trying to measure the processes that we care about across multiple levels of analysis to really home in on the key constructs that we care about. So this is what we know. What we don't know, however, is whether self-distancing does in fact lead people to place more weight on the rights and interests of others as compared to the self. And this is the essence of what we want to do with 21 months of funding. Or is it 21 or 24?
21.
21, I thought it was 24, okay. 21 months of funding that is on the table. Our specific goal is to rigorously test this claim using a multi-method approach that includes both laboratory and field methods. So we've got two aims. The first is to use lab-based studies to really get in, with very tightly controlled conditions, get in there and try to isolate causal mechanisms, test our predictions, and just to be clear, the key prediction here is that distancing should, in fact, lead people to tip the scale more towards other people as compared to the self, although the mediating mechanisms are a bit in dispute. They're in dispute if you ask Smith and his protege over here versus me. So deep integration will be needed for that. That's aim one. Aim two is then going to be field research that uses experience sampling to see how do these lab-based results, how do they translate into the real world? And how does the real world inform what we're learning from the lab? So let me walk you through what we have planned for the lab-based studies. Essentially, we're going to present participants with a choice dilemma that requires them to weight their own interests against the interests of others. And there are lots of different tools that exist for creating these choice dilemmas for people. Three examples that we've thought of thus far. A dictator game. You've got some money and you've got to decide how much to keep for yourself, give to someone else. A public goods game. Blow that up a bit. Multiple parties now. Each have a pot of money. The adaptive solution is for everyone to put in the money in the middle of the pot. Everyone benefits. Or you can be a freeloader. Keep all the money for yourself. Another way of looking at this prioritization. And then we can go to social psychology, where there are a range of really kind of fun helping tasks. So you put people under time pressure. Your performance and how much money you're going to get from me, the experimenter, depends on how quickly you do this task. But someone comes in and spills a whole bucket of peanuts, and they're in despair because they were very hungry and wanted to eat them up. And do you stop what you're doing to help them? So forth and so on. So lots of different tools we have at our disposal. And we do, in fact, want to run multiple iterations of the experiment I'm going to tell you about in a second to look at conceptual replicability and so forth. What we will do is randomly assign people to one of three conditions: self-immerse, self-distance, or control, using procedures that we've used in the past successfully. One really powerful tool that we have at our disposal for manipulating distance is language. Okay, so what we would do for our participants is give them a cover story along the following lines. One of the things we're interested in this study is the relationship between language and decision-making. Some people report reflecting on their decisions using first-person pronouns. So that's what we'd like you to do. Ask yourself, what should I do? Okay, that's our immersed manipulation. In the distancing cell, people get the exact same cover story. We're interested in the connection between language and decision-making. Some people report using their own name and other non-first person pronouns. So that's what we'd like you to do. Ask yourself, if I'm the participant, what should Ethan do? We've got lots of evidence, I'd be happy to talk to you about it, showing that that simple linguistic shift serves a powerful distancing function, which is an interesting phenomenon in its own right. And the control group is a control, no manipulation there. After the manipulation, what we're going to do is assess potential mediating mechanisms, self-report, emotion. We're going to measure physiological arousal continuously with galvanic skin response. And we're also going to measure other concept accessibility. How accessible are thoughts about the self versus other people using a lexical decision task or other kinds of implicit measures depending on the specific way the experiment takes shape. And then, of course, we'll assess our DV. Do you prioritize a self? Do you freeload or not? That's the lab. What we'll then do is we'll go into the field. And here what we'll do is first make use of a distancing intervention that we've recently developed and successfully piloted. It's 20 minutes long. It's computer-based. It teaches people how to use language to distance in particular situations. And so what we will do is randomly assign our participants to one of three groups: self-distancing training, self-immersion training, or a no-treatment control group. We will then use experience sampling, which, thank you for the folks who came before us for helping define it. Essentially what this technology does, it makes use of people's smartphones, and what you can do is you text message people throughout the day over time, over consecutive days, and you probe them with questions, and it's a really neat way of trying to understand how psychological processes unfold in daily life and over time. It's a really neat and powerful way for looking at how the way you feel or behave at one moment in time can predict how you subsequently feel. Kind of lagged analysis that speaks to issues about causality. And importantly, it also eliminates a number of the biases, though not all, but many biases that are inherent in self-report survey methods, and we can talk about that if you like. So this is the technology. What we will do is text message people 5 times a day for 14 days. That may sound a lot. We've done it successfully. What we do make sure to do is we go to great care when designing these studies to make sure we don't ask too many questions because we don't want to overburden people. The questions that we have in mind are a series of close-ended and open-ended questions. Close-ended questions will involve asking participants to rate their feelings, arousal, level of self, and other focus. And then open-ended questions will involve asking people to indicate whether they've experienced conflict with another person since the last time we texted them, and if so, how did you manage it? What happened? Right? Just use your fingertips to type that in, as well as indicate whether they've cooperated with another person since the last time we've text messaged. And we'll then content analyze those responses for constructs that we care about. Let me quickly, how am I doing on time? 2 minutes, okay. Potential challenges, and did that take into account? I'm joking. Potential challenges and solutions here. So number one, can we integrate deeply? We're really excited about the opportunity to do this. Warren and I have, and Walt Sowden, who's here as well, we've been thinking about this for a while. Walter and I have been writing about other stuff, but I think all the pieces are here. The necessary expertise, interest. What we have to do is formally start doing the work. So I think we can, and we're excited to integrate. Can we run the proposed studies? We have access to all of the apparatus that you would need to do this, fully equipped labs, experience sampling protocols, and so forth. Can we recruit and retain participants? Right? This is not always easy to do for experience sampling studies. We've got incentivization schemes worked out from having done this in the past that it assures us that we will have people stick with us in our work. Can we perform the required analyses? So I haven't gotten into the analyses. Some of these fall within my pay grade. Some exceed it. And I know when they exceed it because I get dizzy in those situations. And we have a statistical consult and former colleague, Philippe Verdun, to help us out when that happens. Finally, issues concerning replicability and robustness. We're going to try to conceptually replicate in the lab and also use large samples. I will end with potential promise, 15 seconds. I think there are 4 key contributions that we're really excited about. Number one, I really do believe that this has the potential to provide a real deep integration between the psychology and the philosophy behind self-distancing in a way that has not been done before. From the basic science side of things, what this work has the potential to do is really identify in a fine-grained way how self-distancing, if it does at all, impacts virtue across multiple levels of analysis. In addition, show the real-world validity of this research, so I could go and tell my mom about it, and she won't yawn, although she might. That was a joke. And then finally, really develop a blueprint for enhancing virtue in daily life, assuming that people or groups would like to enhance their virtue. And that is it.
So you're talking about this in terms of self-distancing. I think Trope's lab has for a long time been talking about the importance of distancing in respect to proximity to a problem as opposed to self-distancing in some sense, which is just maybe a perspectival difference. But I'm wondering if you've thought about some of the work from Trope's lab in negotiation, et cetera, and interpreting it in terms of the virtues.
So we've thought about Trope quite a bit. I don't have a straightforward answer for you in terms of how our model of distancing compares to his. What I could tell you is that 3/4 of the time our perspectives line up really well, but 1/4 of the times they not only don't line up well, they also flip. So for example, in some work that he's done with psychological distance as manipulated temporally, spatially, and so forth, he gets enhancement or more likely to making the fundamental attribution error. We find the reverse. I think a key difference is that, number one, in most of the work that I've done, affect is always evolved in what is going on. And I think affect, you could think of it as a potential moderator of how the distancing mechanism, as he speaks of it, works. Well, let's just stick with the number one, actually. The number two is a little bit more murky.
I have a follow-up to that, if I
Yeah,
may,
sure.
or something, a similar question. It's been a long time since I've read the theory of moral sentiment, so I'll defer to your expertise on this. But my memory is that when Adam Smith talked about self-distancing, he talked about trying to get to the perspective of the impartial spectator. And that's a particular kind of distancing from self. Now you see a couple of other kinds of distancing from self in some other psychological experiments, some by Dan Cervone on addiction to cigarette smoking. And there Cervone uses the concept of the obligatory self and the ideal self. So how tempted is an ideal self going to be? So I imagine myself not to desire smoking cigarettes at all. Or I imagine myself as someone who ought not to smoke cigarettes. How strong is the temptation going to be if I imagine myself in those circumstances? So what is the perspective that the distancing is supposed to incorporate, and how does that perspective faithfully replicate Adam Smith?
So Adam Smith is often read as an ideal observer theorist. So typically he's listed. John Rawls in his discussion of ideal observer theory starts off with Adam Smith and discusses Firth and all these sorts of people. But that's not really his view. There's moderate idealization. Really, he just requires full information regarding the relevant facts of the matter. So we certainly don't want to imagine ourselves as some spectator who doesn't know anything about the situation. That would be a problem. But there's no normative idealization. We're not thinking of a spectator who doesn't want to smoke cigarettes or anything like that. It's really just me, if I were the spectator of my own conduct. Now it gets a little more complicated when you place an individual in a social context, because now they're going to be influenced through conversation with other people. It might be that when I imagine myself the spectator of my own behavior and I'm talking to you and you bring some other perspective to bear, I'm now going to incorporate some of your thoughts or opinions or perspectives on things. So that might change me, but that kind of all goes beyond what we're trying to look at here, because the fundamental mechanism that Smith presents is just me knowing all the facts, but not being me looking at myself as another, and that's it.
Just a brief follow-up, if I may. I also thought that Smith, and here again I could be wrong, launched the notion of the ideal sympathetic spectator, or the benevolent spectator.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that if that's so, then that builds in a key component that might be crucial for your testing of the claim about the sensitivity to the rights and interests of others.
Okay, so now we're getting into really complicated area. The ideally sympathetic spectator is definitely not a Smithian idea. So that's really an idea from John Harsanyi, who claims that he was taking this idea from Adam Smith, and I just think he was misreading Adam Smith. But he speaks of the impartially sympathetic observer. He says that he's just providing a modern, formulation of Adam Smith's theory. But actually, for Smith, the sympathy itself is an evaluative process. When I attempt to sympathize with somebody else, I'm judging them. If I can sympathize with them perfectly, I will approve of their conduct as proper, fitting for their circumstances. If I fail to sympathize, then I disapprove. So we actually need the capacity for both sympathy and a failure to sympathize in the impartial spectator.
And
if we require...
Can I jump in on
Sure,
that?
yeah.
And one of the nice things about what we're going to be doing is we can actually test that empirically, because we'll have thought content data on these participants, and we can actually code for ideal, odd sympathy, and other theoretically relevant constructs.
Will?
Yeah, I wanted to ask just a little clarification about the experience sampling part.
Sure.
And it looked like you're going to test for the effects of self-distancing by a manipulation prior to the experience sampling, and then just look at sort of like the aggregate number of things in the experience sampling.
Well, that's one thing we could do, but we could also look at mediating mechanisms over time and looking to see how the effect is basically transmitted from one moment to the next.
So are you going to measure self-distancing in the moment?
No, so we're not measuring
Okay.
self-distancing in the moment. What we will be measuring, though, is self-other accessibility, emotions, and physiological arousal, which are the theoretically relevant
Right.
mediators that we expect this manipulation, how that should impact cooperation, if you will, or privileging rights of others. So if we were to measure self-distancing, that would be, we could think of that as one step prior to those other mediators, but I think there's some risk in doing that also. So
What's the risk? Yeah.
of continually asking them to reflect back on how they thought with language about their experience is psychologically a more difficult exercise to have people engage in than how do you feel right now in this moment.
Okay.
So it's one of those
Yeah.
crafting trade-offs.
It's unclear to me how you're defining virtue. You seem to have, the measures that you're using, the outcome measures are behavioral economic kind of measures, at least the ones you mentioned, which to me
Some of
seems
them
like a very thin notion of what virtuous behavior is. So could you say more about what you have in mind that maybe you haven't told us?
Yeah, so we're starting with the conception of virtue articulated by Adam Smith, and it includes more than just the measures we're looking at in this particular study. So here we're just looking at part of it, the placing more weight on the rights and interests of another. So when there's some sort of conflict of interests, I can either keep the money for myself or give it to you or whatever, not help you or go over there and help you and incur some cost of my own. It's testing that particular part of his formulation of the perfectly virtuous moral agent. There's also the other part, the capacity for self-control, self-command, which fits into his full articulation that was up there a while ago. So the full idea is the ideally virtuous moral agent is one who is capable of perfect self-command and also who places more weight on the interests and rights of others. Now that might just be one part of a larger picture of virtue. And at least from the beginning of the experiment, we'll see where this study goes, we're not really taking a position on that. We could just be looking at this particular component of virtue, which is within a larger overall conception.
Yeah, and economic games are part of it, but one of the exciting things about this package, at least in my eyes, is that we're going to have multiple ways of looking at this tendency to prioritize self versus other, including economic games, but also other kind of measures like in the experience sampling study. The frequency with which you are engaging in interpersonal conflict and how you're resolving that, which will then be able to code and presumably generate, that'll generate richer data that we can look to see how that scaffolds on to not only Smith's conception of virtue, but potentially others.
Yeah,
too.
that process might actually enlarge the conception of virtue that we're working with. But we're
Other, Well, we haven't run the study yet, so what would you like them to do? So in reality, they're usually a mix of college students and members of the community. What we do really want to do, though, is use large samples. We want them to be as representative as possible, and so that's where the feasibility comes into play. So.
I think we're out of time, so thank you very much. And,